Picture this. It's 1943, somewhere in the American heartland. The sun hasn't yet broken the horizon, but a farmer named John is already in his fields, his hands cracked and weathered, working a tractor that should have been replaced years ago. His two eldest sons are somewhere in Europe, fighting battles he can only imagine from the radio broadcasts that crackle through his kitchen each evening. His youngest daughter, barely 16, operates the corn picker alongside him, doing work that would have been considered too demanding for a woman just a few years earlier. The harvest must come in, not just for his family, not just for his community, but for soldiers on 3 continents who depend on American wheat to fill their bellies before they face another day of combat. This scene, repeated across millions of farms on every inhabited continent, represents one of the most crucial yet overlooked aspects of World War II. We remember the beaches of Normandy, the islands of the Pacific, the siege of Stalingrad. We celebrate the factory workers who built the tanks and ships, the code breakers who deciphered enemy communications, the pilots who commanded the skies. But we've largely forgotten the farmers who waged a different kind of war, a war against hunger, fought not with bullets and bombs, but with plows and seeds, sweat and soil. The agricultural mobilization of World War II was nothing short of revolutionary. It transformed how nations produced food, who worked the land, and the very relationship between citizen and soil. It was a mobilization that saw suburban homeowners become vegetable farmers, German prisoners of war harvesting sugar beets in Colorado, British housewives digging up their rose gardens to plant potatoes, and Soviet women operating tractors, while German armies advanced toward their collective farms. It was a mobilization that would reshape global agriculture for generations to come, setting the stage for the Green Revolution and fundamentally altering how humanity feeds itself. This is the story of farmers feeding the war, the story of how agriculture became a weapon as important as any tank or battleship, the story of a transformation so complete, so total, that it touched every farm, every field, every family meal across the warring world. It's a story of innovation and desperation, of triumph and tragedy, of ordinary people performing extraordinary feats of production under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. And it's a story that deserves to be told, because without understanding this agricultural mobilization, we cannot truly understand how World War II was won, or the price that was paid in barns and fields far from any battlefield. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, agriculture stood at a crossroads. The world still bore the scars of the Great Depression, which had devastated farming communities across the globe. Prices for agricultural commodities had collapsed throughout the 1930s. Farmers had lost their land to foreclosure. Dust storms had turned fertile plains into wastelands in America's heartland. The agricultural sector, already struggling, now faced demands unprecedented in human history. The mathematics of feeding a global war were staggering. The United States alone would eventually mobilize 16 million men and women into military service. Britain, with a population of roughly 47 million, would put nearly 5 million into uniform. The Soviet Union would ultimately field over 34 million personnel. Each of these soldiers required between 3,000 and 4,000 calories per day, far more than the average civilian. They needed protein to build muscle and endurance, carbohydrates for quick energy, vitamins to prevent disease in the field. An army, as Napoleon had observed more than a century earlier, marches on its stomach. But feeding the military was only part of the challenge. Civilian populations had to be sustained as well. In Britain, where merchant ships were being sunk by German submarines at an alarming rate, food imports that had previously supplied more than half the nation's needs were suddenly unreliable. The British government calculated that without dramatic changes to domestic agriculture, the nation could face starvation within months. In the Soviet Union, where vast agricultural regions would fall under German occupation, food production would plummet even as the need for it skyrocketed. In Japan, an island nation dependent on imports and colonial holdings, the American submarine campaign would create food shortages that bordered on catastrophic. The challenge wasn't simply one of quantity. The nature of warfare in the 20th century created specific nutritional demands. Soldiers needed concentrated, portable food that could withstand extremes of temperature and rough handling. They needed rations that wouldn't spoil during long sea voyages to distant theaters of combat. The development of these specialized military rations required new techniques in food processing, new crops specifically suited to dehydration or canning, new understanding of nutrition under stress. Consider the humble potato. Before the war, potatoes were simply potatoes, a staple crop grown and consumed fresh or stored in root cellars. But wartime needs transformed them. Scientists developed methods to dehydrate potatoes into flakes and powder that could be reconstituted with water, dramatically reducing the weight and volume that had to be shipped to soldiers in the field. This single innovation saved thousands of tons of shipping capacity that could instead carry ammunition or medical supplies. The same transformation occurred with eggs, milk, vegetables, even meat, as the demands of war drove agricultural science in entirely new directions. The labor situation presented another insurmountable challenge. As young men left farms to join the military or take higher-paying jobs in war industries, the agricultural workforce shrank dramatically. In the United States, farm population declined from roughly 31 million in 1940 to 24 million by 1945. In Britain, hundreds of thousands of agricultural workers enlisted or were conscripted. The Soviet Union, where collectivization had already disrupted traditional farming communities, saw entire villages emptied of working-age men. Who would plant the crops? Who would bring in the harvests? How could production increase even as the workforce decreased? Weather and nature, indifferent to human conflict, added their own complications. The 1940 growing season in parts of Europe was marked by unusual cold and wet conditions. American farmers faced droughts in some regions, floods in others. Soviet agriculture, still recovering from the devastation of forced collectivization and the resulting famines of the early 1930s, operated on razor-thin margins, even in the best of times. Japanese farmers, working small plots on mountainous islands with limited arable land, had no capacity to absorb weather-related crop failures. The infrastructure of agriculture was equally problematic. Farm equipment in the late 1930s was often outdated and in poor repair. Many farmers still relied primarily on horse and mule power. Tractors, while becoming more common, were far from universal, and the factories that produced them would soon be retooled to manufacture tanks and military vehicles. Fertilizer production, essential for maximizing yields, used the same chemical plants that would be needed to produce explosives. The transportation networks required to move food from farm to city, from port to battlefield, were the same railroads and ships needed to move troops and military supplies. This was the situation as the world descended into global conflict. Agriculture, already stressed, already struggling, now faced demands that seemed impossible to meet. Production would have to increase dramatically even as resources decreased. More food would have to be grown with fewer workers, less equipment, diminished supplies of fertilizer and other inputs. Entirely new crops would need to be developed, new preservation techniques invented, new distribution systems created. The transformation required would touch every aspect of agricultural life, from the largest industrial farm to the smallest backyard vegetable patch. The story of how this transformation occurred, how farmers and agricultural scientists and government officials and ordinary citizens met this challenge, is a story of remarkable adaptation and innovation. It's a story that begins in the fields and barns of America, where our agricultural revolution was already underway even before Pearl Harbor thrust the United States into open combat. American agriculture in 1940 was a sector in transition, still bearing deep wounds from a decade of economic depression, but beginning to see glimmers of recovery. The Dust Bowl had finally relented, though its scars remained visible across the Great Plains. Farm prices, while still depressed, had started to edge upward. The New Deal's agricultural programs had brought some stability, though they remained controversial and imperfect. Into this uncertain landscape came the demands of a global war, demands that would test American farming to its limits and beyond. The transformation began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in early 1940. Even before the United States formally entered the war, the Lend-Lease program was funneling American agricultural products to Britain and other allies. The Department of Agriculture, which had spent the Depression years encouraging farmers to reduce production to boost prices, suddenly reversed course. Now the message was clear: produce more, plant more, grow more. Every bushel of wheat, every pound of pork, every ton of soybeans mattered. Food, Secretary of Agriculture Claude Wickard proclaimed, was a weapon in total war. The production numbers tell a remarkable story. Between 1940 and 1945, American farmers increased their output by roughly 25%, even as their workforce shrank dramatically. Harvested acres of corn grew by 9%, wheat by 15%, oats by 22%. Cash receipts from farm products doubled, jumping from $9 billion in 1940 to $22 billion in 1945. The index of gross farm production, using 1939 as a baseline of 100, climbed from 108 in 1940 to 126 in 1946. These weren't marginal improvements. They represented a fundamental restructuring of American agricultural capacity. How did farmers achieve these production gains with fewer workers? The answer lay partly in mechanization. The number of tractors on American farms increased from about 1.6 million in 1940 to 2.4 million by 1945, a growth of roughly 67%. These weren't the massive machines we see on farms today, but compared to horse-drawn equipment, they represented a quantum leap in productivity. A farmer with a tractor could plow, plant, and harvest far more land than one relying on animal power. The shift was particularly dramatic in wheat country, where mechanized combines replaced the old threshing crews that had once been essential to bringing in the harvest. But machinery alone doesn't explain the production miracle. American farmers also benefited from increased use of hybrid seeds, which offered higher yields than traditional varieties. The adoption of commercial fertilizers accelerated, despite shortages caused by wartime demands on chemical plants. Farmers planted more intensively, reducing fallow periods and maximizing every available acre. They extended their workdays, worked through weekends, and pushed themselves and their equipment to the breaking point. The war created what one agricultural historian called the greatest sustained effort in American farming history. This effort came with costs. Farm equipment, scarce due to wartime production priorities, became nearly impossible to purchase new. Farmers nursed ancient tractors and combines through one more season, improvising repairs, cannibalizing parts from broken machines to keep others running. The rationing of gasoline and rubber affected farmers less severely than urban residents, but it still created complications. Tires for tractors and trucks wore out and couldn't be replaced. Farmers adapted by fitting steel wheels to equipment, returning to practices not seen since the early days of mechanization. The labor situation grew increasingly desperate. By 1943, the agricultural workforce had shrunk to critically low levels. Farms that had once employed multiple hired hands now struggled to find anyone at all. The Extension Service estimated that agricultural labor needs exceeded available workers by several million people. This gap had to be filled somehow, or the crops would rot in the fields despite all the effort that had gone into planting them. The solution came from multiple sources, each remarkable in its own way. the government established the Emergency Farm Labor Program in April 1943, giving the Extension Service in each state responsibility for recruiting, transporting, and placing agricultural workers. This program would eventually mobilize millions of people who had never before worked on farms, creating what officials called a land army or U.S. Crop Corps. One crucial component was the bracero program, negotiated with Mexico in August 1942. This program brought Mexican workers to the United States to fill agricultural labor needs. Between 1943 and 1945, hundreds of thousands of braceros worked on American farms, particularly in the Southwest and Great Plains. They thinned sugar beets in Colorado, picked cotton in Texas, harvested wheat in Kansas. The program was not without its problems. The braceros faced discrimination, poor living conditions, and sometimes outright exploitation. But their labor was essential to keeping American agriculture productive during the critical war years. Children became another vital source of farm labor. Schools adjusted their calendars to accommodate planting and harvest seasons. The Victory Farm Volunteers program recruited students to work on farms during summer vacations and extended breaks. More than 1 million young people participated, spending weeks or months living in rural communities, doing hard physical labor in fields and barns. For many urban and suburban children, it was their first real encounter with agricultural work, an experience that shaped their understanding of where food came from and the effort required to produce it. Women filled gaps in the agricultural workforce in unprecedented numbers. The percentage of women employed in agriculture rose from 8% in 1940 to more than 22% by 1945. These weren't just farm wives doing the work they'd always done, though that intensified dramatically. City women, office workers, teachers, took jobs on farms, learning to drive tractors, milk cows, operate combines. The Extension Service estimated it placed approximately 1.5 million non-farm women in agricultural jobs between 1943 and 1945, with an equal number recruited directly by farmers. The Women's Land Army, modelled after a similar British organisation, became an important part of this effort. Formerly organised by the Department of Agriculture in 1943, the WLA recruited women to work on farms across the country. Not all regions embraced the idea. Some Midwest states rejected the notion of women farm workers, preferring to rely on other labor sources. But where it operated, the WLA demonstrated that women could perform virtually any agricultural task. They plowed fields, harvested crops, cared for livestock, repaired equipment. Many worked seasonally, spending a few weeks helping with critical tasks before returning to their regular jobs. Others committed to agricultural work for the duration of the war. Prisoners of war represented yet another labor source, one that would prove both controversial and essential. As German and Italian POWs arrived in the United States by the hundreds of thousands, the question arose of what to do with them. The Geneva Conventions permitted the use of prisoner labor, provided they were paid and not employed in work directly supporting the war effort. Agriculture fit these criteria perfectly. Beginning in 1943, POW camps were established across the country, particularly in rural areas where farm labor was most desperately needed. The prisoners worked on farms, in canneries, in food processing plants. Their contribution to American agricultural production was substantial, and we'll explore their story in greater detail later. Despite all these efforts, agricultural officials in some communities still struggled to find enough workers. Business leaders in Dallas were asked to release employees for field work during critical periods. Few volunteered. In Cheyenne, Wyoming, businessmen and their employees were urged to spend summer vacations working on nearby farms. The response was lukewarm. A survey of high school students in Oklahoma City found that most had no intention of working on farms, even for patriotic reasons, when they could earn $100 or more per month in city jobs. The competition for labor was fierce, and agriculture often lost out to higher-paying industrial work. The federal government tried to ease the burden through various programs and policies. Price supports helped ensure farmers could afford to invest in their operations. Loans were made available for purchasing equipment and expanding acreage. The government rationed certain agricultural inputs to ensure fair distribution. Agricultural extension agents worked overtime to disseminate information about new techniques and best practices. County agents coordinated local labor, recruitment efforts, matching workers with farms that needed help. Perhaps most remarkably, the American people themselves became farmers on a scale never before seen. This wasn't mandated from above. It grew organically from a combination of patriotic fervor, practical necessity, and shrewd government encouragement. It was called the Victory Garden Movement, and it would transform the American landscape and American attitudes toward food production in ways that resonate even today. In December 1941, as the shock of Pearl Harbor still reverberated through American consciousness, Secretary of Agriculture Claude Wickard began promoting what would become one of the most successful civilian mobilization campaigns in American history. He called them Victory Gardens, and his vision was ambitious: turn every available plot of land, every backyard, every vacant lot into productive farmland. Make every American household a farm in miniature. The idea wasn't entirely new. Similar war gardens had been promoted during World War I, but the scale of the World War II Victory Garden movement would dwarf anything that had come before. The logic behind Victory Gardens was compelling. Commercial agriculture was already stretched thin, trying to feed both the military and civilian populations while dealing with severe labor shortages. If families could grow even a portion of their own vegetables, it would free up commercial production for military needs and reduce the burden on the nation's transportation infrastructure. Every tomato grown in a backyard garden was one less tomato that had to be trucked from a farm, processed in a cannery, shipped across the country. Every carrot pulled from a community garden plot was one more carrot that could be sent to soldiers overseas. The Department of Agriculture threw itself into promoting victory gardens with remarkable energy and sophistication. Pamphlets were produced and distributed by the millions, offering advice on everything from selecting the right garden site to preserving the harvest for winter use. Sample planting schedules showed newcomers how to grow enough vegetables to feed a family for an entire year. Detailed instructions covered soil preparation, fertilization, planting techniques, weeding, and harvesting. The government even developed a special victory garden fertilizer for home use, recognizing that many urban and suburban gardeners had little experience with the science of soil nutrition. Magazines and newspapers joined the campaign enthusiastically. Articles about victory gardens appeared in publications ranging from McCall's to Time, from the Saturday Evening Post to Country Gentleman. The tone was relentlessly optimistic, emphasizing that gardening wasn't just a patriotic duty, but also a pleasurable family activity that promoted health and self-reliance. Propaganda posters appeared everywhere, showing images of bountiful vegetables and encouraging citizens to dig for victory and remember that food will win the war. The American people responded with extraordinary enthusiasm. By 1943, approximately 20 million victory gardens were planted across the United States. Consider that number for a moment. In a nation of roughly 132 million people, 20 million households were growing vegetables. That's nearly half of all American families engaged in food production. These weren't token efforts or symbolic gestures. These were serious gardens, carefully tended, intensively planted, designed to produce substantial amounts of food. The production figures were staggering. In 1943 alone, victory gardens produced an estimated 10 billion pounds of vegetables. That's 10,000 million pounds of food grown in backyards, on rooftops, in vacant lots, in parks. By 1944, victory gardens were responsible for producing 40% of all vegetables grown in the United States. Think about that. Nearly half of the nation's vegetable supply came from small plots tended by amateurs. This wasn't marginal production. This was a fundamental shift in how America fed itself. The gardens themselves varied tremendously in size and sophistication. Some families with large suburban lots created extensive vegetable plots, growing dozens of different crops. Others made do with small patches in urban backyards, squeezing tomatoes and beans into every available square foot. Window boxes sprouted lettuce and herbs. Rooftops were transformed into container gardens. In New York City, portions of Riverside Park were devoted to victory gardens. In San Francisco, sections of Golden Gate Park were dug up and planted with vegetables. The moat around the Tower of London, an ocean away in Britain, was similarly filled with food crops, a potent symbol of how thoroughly the war had transformed ordinary landscapes. Schools became important sites for victory gardens. Across the country, athletic fields and playgrounds were converted into growing spaces. Students learned to plant, weed, and harvest as part of their regular curriculum. Some schools used their produce in school lunch programs, introducing children to vegetables they'd grown themselves. The experience was educational in ways that went far beyond agricultural technique. Children learned about biology and chemistry, about the seasons and weather, about the connection between soil and plate. Many urban children encountered mud and earthworms for the first time in their lives. War plants and factories maintained their own victory gardens, using the produce in company cafeterias. This served dual purposes. It reduced the cost of feeding workers while creating a sense of shared purpose and community. Workers who might spend all day assembling airplane parts or welding ship hulls could spend their lunch breaks tending tomatoes and squash, a tangible connection to the earth and to life-giving work in the midst of an enterprise dedicated to destruction. Even Japanese Americans, imprisoned in internment camps, participated in the Victory Garden movement, a bitter irony that speaks to both the pervasiveness of the campaign and the complexity of the war years. In camps like Manzana and Grenada, internees created extensive gardens, growing both traditional Japanese vegetables and American crops. Archaeological evidence from these sites reveals pollen from potatoes and ornamental plants, seeds from Chinese elm trees planted for shade and for bonsai. The internees used whatever they could find to amend the desert soils, making them productive despite harsh conditions. These gardens provided both supplemental food and a psychological connection to normalcy and purpose in a situation defined by injustice and deprivation. The Victory Garden movement fostered innovation in home food preservation. Growing vegetables was only part of the challenge. Those vegetables had to be preserved for use through the winter months. Women's magazines published extensive articles about canning, freezing, pickling, and drying. The government's campaign slogan, "Grow your own, can your own," reflected this dual emphasis on production and preservation. Community canning centers were established where families could process their harvests using commercial-scale equipment. County extension agents taught classes on safe canning techniques, proper processing times, how to prevent spoilage and food poisoning. The emphasis on preservation was crucial. A victory garden that produced abundantly during summer and fall, but provided nothing during winter and spring, was only solving half the problem. The goal was year-round self-sufficiency, or as close to it as possible. Families learned to dry beans and herbs, to store root vegetables in cool cellars, to pickle everything from cucumbers to beets to watermelon rind. They made preserves and jellies from fruit, turned tomatoes into sauce and paste, packed vegetables in brine. The knowledge and skills developed during these years would influence American food culture for generations. Not everyone found victory gardening easy or successful. Soil in many urban areas was poor, depleted by years of use or contaminated by industrial pollution. Novice gardeners made mistakes, planting at the wrong times, choosing unsuitable crops for their climates, battling pests and diseases they didn't know how to identify or treat. One teenager recalled planting an ambitious victory garden, but harvesting only radishes. Everything else failed. Another family devoted significant space to vegetables, only to have their entire crop destroyed by an early frost. But even failures taught lessons and built knowledge that proved valuable in subsequent years. The Victory Garden movement succeeded because it aligned multiple motivations. Certainly patriotism played a role. People wanted to contribute to the war effort in tangible ways, and gardening offered a clear connection between personal action and national need. But practical considerations mattered too. Rationing limited access to many foods, and victory gardens provided a way to supplement restricted diets. Fresh vegetables from one's own garden weren't subject to rationing coupons. Families could eat as much as they grew, a small but meaningful freedom in a time of widespread restriction. Economic factors also drove participation. Vegetables from victory gardens cost significantly less than store-bought produce. For families struggling to make ends meet on wartime budgets, especially those who had lost primary wage earners to military service, the savings could be substantial. A well-tended garden could reduce a family's food expenses by 20 to 30% or more. In an era when every penny mattered, that was significant. The psychological benefits shouldn't be discounted either. Gardening provided a sense of control and agency in a time when so much felt uncertain and beyond individual influence. Working in soil, watching seeds sprout and plants grow, harvesting tangible results from one's labor. These activities offered comfort and hope. Gardening connected people to natural rhythms and seasonal cycles, providing perspective and grounding amid the chaos of global war. For many, especially those with loved ones in combat, the garden became a space for meditation and prayer, a place where hands and hearts could find purpose, while minds worried about distant dangers. The Victory Garden movement created community in powerful ways. Neighborhood groups formed to share knowledge, tools, and seeds. Experienced gardeners mentored novices. Surplus produce was traded or donated to those in need. Garden clubs, which had previously focused on ornamental flowers, redirected their energies toward vegetables, organizing competitions for the best tomatoes or the largest pumpkins. These competitions weren't trivial. They built knowledge and encouraged excellence, pushing gardeners to experiment and improve their techniques. The movement's success depended heavily on expert guidance and coordination. County extension agents worked overtime to provide advice and troubleshooting. Garden clubs offered classes and demonstrations. Seed companies produced instructional materials and helped ensure that popular varieties remained available despite wartime shortages. The Farm Journal published regular columns on victory gardening. Radio programs offered seasonal advice, telling listeners when to plant, how to manage specific pests, which varieties performed best in different regions. Mickey Mouse and other popular characters were enlisted in the cause. Disney created educational materials, encouraging children to participate in victory gardening. A green thumb contest promoted the 3 V's: vegetables, vitamins, and vitality. Superheroes took breaks from fighting fascists to promote growing food. Bob Hope's daughter Linda was photographed carefully planting bean sprouts. These cultural touchstones helped normalize victory gardening, making it not just acceptable, but aspirational and even fashionable. By war's end, victory gardens had fundamentally altered American attitudes toward food production. Millions of people who had never gardened before discovered they could grow food successfully. They learned that soil and seeds, sun and water, could be transformed through human effort into nutrition and sustenance. The knowledge and skills developed during these years didn't disappear when the war ended. Many families continued gardening long after victory gardens officially ceased. The movement laid groundwork for later interest in organic gardening, farmers' markets, and the broader food movement that would emerge in subsequent decades. The Victory Garden phenomenon in America was paralleled by similar efforts across the Atlantic, where the stakes were even higher and the need more desperate. In Britain, where German submarines threatened to starve the nation into submission, citizens answered their government's call to dig for victory with determination born of necessity. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, the nation faced an agricultural crisis of existential proportions. Before the war, Britain had imported roughly 55 million tons of food annually. The island nation, with its limited arable land and large industrial population, simply could not feed itself from domestic production alone. British agriculture supplied perhaps 45% of the nation's food needs. The remainder came by ship from North America, the Empire, and other trading partners. Now those ships were being hunted by German U-boats, sent to the bottom of the Atlantic with increasing frequency. Each sinking meant thousands of tons of food lost, ships and crews that would never deliver their cargoes to British ports. The mathematics were terrifying. Without radical changes, Britain could be starved into surrender within months. The government response was swift and comprehensive. In October 1939, just weeks after war began, the Ministry of Agriculture launched the Dig for Victory campaign. The message was urgent and clear. Every available piece of land must be turned to food production. Front lawns and flower beds, public parks and cricket grounds, any space that could support a vegetable plant was needed. This wasn't a suggestion or a request. For Britain, Dig for Victory was a matter of national survival. The campaign was brilliantly orchestrated, combining propaganda, practical support, and cultural mobilization in ways that transformed British society. Posters appeared everywhere, showing images of robust vegetables and the slogan, "Dig for Victory," in bold letters. One iconic poster depicted a small boy, seen from behind, wearing a white hat and shorts, carrying a spade and hoe, walking determinedly toward the viewer. The image was simple but powerful. Even children must contribute. Everyone has a role to play. The nation's future depends on what we grow today. The government produced millions of instructional leaflets and distributed them freely to the public. These weren't vague encouragements, but detailed, practical guides to gardening. They covered everything from soil preparation to crop rotation, from dealing with pests to preserving the harvest. The information was presented clearly and accessibly, assuming readers had little or no prior experience with agriculture. Sample garden plans showed how to maximize production in small spaces. Lists of recommended varieties identified crops that grew well in British conditions and offered good nutritional value. Perhaps the campaign's most effective element was making gardening not just necessary, but fashionable. The government enlisted celebrities and public figures to promote Dig for Victory. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth planted vegetables at Buckingham Palace, demonstrating that even royalty was expected to contribute. Their example was widely publicized, sending a clear message that no one was above the call to dig. If the King and Queen were growing cabbages and potatoes, surely every British subject could do the same. Radio played a crucial role in spreading gardening knowledge across the nation. C.H. Middleton, who became Britain's first celebrity gardener, hosted a Sunday afternoon program on the BBC Home Service called In Your Garden. By 1940, his show attracted 3.5 million listeners, roughly 70% of people with radio access. Middleton's style was friendly and accessible, offering practical advice in a conversational tone that made gardening seem approachable rather than daunting. He told listeners when to plant potatoes, how to grow leeks, what to do about cabbage worms. Millions of British gardeners planned their weekend work around Middleton's advice. Marguerite Patten, another radio personality, focused on the crucial question of what to do with the vegetables once they were harvested. Her cooking programs taught listeners how to prepare unfamiliar crops, how to make nutritious meals from limited ingredients, how to avoid waste. In a time when rationing severely restricted access to meat, fats, and many other foods, vegetables became central to the British diet. Patton's recipes helped make that transition palatable, even enjoyable. The campaign created memorable mascots to promote specific crops. Potato Pete and Dr. Carrot became beloved characters, appearing on posters and in songs designed to encourage consumption of vegetables that were plentiful and easy to grow. The characters served multiple purposes. They made vegetables appealing to children, always a challenge in any era. They also helped manage supply and demand. When certain vegetables were in surplus, increased promotion encouraged people to eat more of them, reducing waste and balancing the food supply. The carrot campaign included some brilliant propaganda. The government spread rumors that British pilots were eating massive quantities of carrots to improve their night vision, allowing them to shoot down German bombers in darkness. This story had multiple advantages. It encouraged carrot consumption during periods of surplus. It boosted morale by suggesting British pilots had superior abilities. And crucially, it helped disguise the fact that Britain had developed radar technology, which was the real secret behind night fighting success. The Germans, hearing these reports, apparently spent time investigating whether carrots truly improved vision rather than focusing on the possibility of new technology. The myth persists today, a testament to the campaign's effectiveness. The scale of British participation in Dig for Victory was remarkable. By the war's end, nearly 1.5 million allotments existed across Britain, producing approximately 1.3 million tons of vegetables annually. An allotment, for readers unfamiliar with British terminology, is a plot of land rented from local governments or private landowners for the purpose of growing food. Allotments had existed before the war, but their numbers exploded as the campaign gained momentum. These weren't tiny token gardens. The standard allotment measured about 300 square yards, roughly 250 square meters, enough space to grow substantial quantities of food. Worked intensively with proper techniques, an allotment could provide a family with vegetables year-round. Many British families supplemented their allotment produce with smaller gardens in their own yards, maximizing every possible growing space. By 1942, War Cabinet records indicated that approximately half of Britain's population participated in the nation's Garden Front, as the campaign was sometimes called. This level of engagement cut across class lines in unprecedented ways. Wealthy families dug up their ornamental gardens and planted vegetables alongside working-class families who had always maintained small kitchen gardens. The shared experience created a sense of common purpose that transcended traditional social divisions. Communal spaces underwent dramatic transformations. Sports fields became vegetable plots. Golf courses were requisitioned for farming. The moat around the Tower of London, one of Britain's most iconic historical sites, was filled with vegetables. Railway embankments sprouted crops. Bombed-out buildings, their ruins cleared away, became vegetable patches. Scars of war transformed into sources of life. London Zoo created demonstration gardens to show urban residents what was possible. Every visible space dedicated to food production served as both practical resource and symbolic statement of national determination. British farmers, meanwhile, faced their own enormous challenges. The government launched the POW campaign, urging farmers to bring marginal land into production. Pastures that had been used for grazing were ploughed up for grain. Hedgerows were removed to create larger, more efficient fields. The total acreage under cultivation in Britain increased dramatically during the war years. Wheat production became a priority, reducing Britain's dependence on imported grain. The Women's Land Army played a crucial role in maintaining agricultural production, as male farm workers joined the military or moved to higher-paying industrial jobs. The WLA, formally established in June 1939, recruited physically fit young women, primarily unmarried and without dependents, willing to be sent anywhere in the country where agricultural labor was needed. By 1944, the Women's Land Army had grown to 80,000 members, an impressive force that proved skeptics wrong about women's capacity for demanding farm work. Land girls, as they were known, performed virtually every task on British farms. They ploughed fields, operated tractors, managed livestock, harvested crops, cleared forests, handled drainage and irrigation work. The work was physically demanding, and often dirty, uncomfortable, and exhausting. Many land girls came from urban backgrounds and had never been on a farm before. They had to learn quickly, adapting to rural life while mastering skills that most men spent years developing. The reception land girls received varied considerably. Some farmers welcomed them gratefully, treating them as valued workers and respecting their contributions. Others were skeptical or even hostile, believing women couldn't or shouldn't do farm work. Land girls had to prove themselves repeatedly, demonstrating competence in the face of doubt and sometimes outright prejudice. Many recalled the satisfaction of winning over doubters, of gaining respect through skill and determination. Living conditions for land girls ranged from comfortable to barely adequate. Some were housed in hostels specifically established for the WLA. Others lived with farming families, their experiences depending largely on the disposition of their hosts. The work was constant and demanding. During peak seasons like harvest, land girls might work from dawn until well after dark, falling into bed exhausted only to rise and do it all again the next day. The British government also mobilized school children for agricultural work, though not quite as extensively as in some other countries. Schools adjusted schedules to allow students to help with critical tasks like harvesting. The program was voluntary rather than mandatory, but patriotic pressure and the culture of the time meant many students participated. For urban children, the experience offered revelations about where food came from and the labor required to produce it. Food rationing in Britain was strict and comprehensive. By August 1942, virtually all food except vegetables and bread was rationed. The weekly ration for one person included 1 fresh egg, 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of tea, 2 ounces of cheese, 8 ounces of sugar, 4 ounces of bacon and ham, a 1 shilling worth of meat, 3 pints of milk, and limited amounts of preserves, sweets, and other items. These were bare subsistence quantities, enough to prevent starvation, but allowing little room for satisfaction or variety. This made homegrown vegetables all the more important. Vegetables and fruit from one's own garden or allotment weren't rationed. Families could eat as much as they grew. This created powerful incentives for gardening that went beyond patriotism. A successful garden meant better, more varied meals. It meant occasional abundance in a time defined by scarcity. The difference between a family with a productive garden and one without could be the difference between adequate nutrition and chronic hunger. The Ministry of Food, responsible for managing rationing and food distribution, ran parallel campaigns to ensure people made the best use of their rations and homegrown produce. Lord Woolton, the Minister of Food, became a public figure through his efforts to make limited food supplies go as far as possible. Woolton pie, a vegetable pie created to use up surplus vegetables and stretch meat rations, became famous if not particularly beloved. The recipe called for vegetables, oatmeal, and vegetable stock baked with a potato crust. It was filling and nutritious, if not exactly exciting. The British government recognized that successful home food production required support beyond propaganda and advice. Chemical fertilizers were in short supply, diverted to commercial agriculture or military uses. The government encouraged composting and the use of organic waste to maintain soil fertility. Pamphlets explained how to make compost heaps, what materials to use, how to manage decomposition. The Dig for Victory campaign promoted the idea that every scrap of organic waste was valuable, not garbage, but potential fertility for next year's garden. Seed supply became a concern as the war progressed. The government took steps to ensure that vegetable seed production continued, and that seed remained available to home gardeners at reasonable prices. Seed companies were encouraged to maintain production of popular varieties. The government even established its own seed production facilities to ensure adequate supply. Gardeners were encouraged to save seed from their own crops when possible, learning techniques for selection and preservation that had become uncommon in an era when most people bought fresh seed each year. The impact of Dig for Victory extended beyond mere statistics of tons produced or acres planted. The campaign fundamentally changed British culture and attitudes toward food and gardening. People who had never thought about agriculture before became intensely aware of growing seasons, weather patterns, soil quality. Knowledge that had been confined to farming communities and dedicated gardeners spread throughout the population. Urban dwellers learned to think like farmers, planning months ahead, considering rotations and companion planting, understanding the connection between soil health and harvest abundance. The campaign also created community in powerful ways. Allotment sites became social spaces where neighbors worked side by side, shared tools and knowledge, traded surplus crops, and built relationships across class and background lines that might never have formed otherwise. Garden clubs organized competitions and demonstrations. Local councils established allotment committees to manage increasing demand for plots. The shared experience of gardening under wartime conditions created bonds that persisted long after the war ended. Perhaps most importantly, Dig for Victory gave ordinary British citizens a way to actively contribute to the war effort. They couldn't all fight on the front lines or work in factories building weapons, but they could grow food, they could dig, and dig they did, transforming the landscape and helping sustain their nation through its darkest hours. The vegetables they grew quite literally helped keep Britain fighting. Without the additional food produced by millions of home gardens and allotments, the U-boat blockade might well have succeeded in starving Britain into submission. Instead, British gardens produced sustenance and determination, proving that victory could be dug one plot at a time. If British agriculture faced serious challenges during the war, Soviet agriculture confronted something far worse: absolute catastrophe on a scale difficult to fully comprehend. The Soviet Union, a vast empire spanning 11 time zones, entered the war already weakened by Stalin's forced collectivization policies of the early 1930s. Those policies had transformed Soviet agriculture from a system of individual peasant farms into massive collective farms, or kolkhozes, and state farms, sovkhozes. The transformation had come at terrible cost: famines that killed millions, the destruction of livestock herds as peasants slaughtered animals rather than surrender them to collectives, the deportation or execution of successful farmers labeled as kulaks and class enemies. By 1941, Soviet agriculture was less productive than it had been before collectivization, despite all the suffering imposed in its name. Then came Operation Barbarossa. In June 1941, German forces invaded the Soviet Union with unprecedented fury, advancing rapidly across Western territories. These territories contained some of the Soviet Union's most fertile agricultural land. The Black Earth region of Ukraine, the breadbasket that had fed the Russian Empire for centuries, fell under German occupation. Collective farms in Belarus, the Baltic states, and Western Russia were overrun. Agricultural areas that had produced millions of tons of grain and millions of head of livestock were suddenly behind enemy lines, their output serving the German war machine rather than feeding Soviet citizens and soldiers. The numbers tell a story of devastation. Grain production in the Soviet Union fell from 95 million tons in 1940 to just 29 million in 1942, a decline of roughly 70%. Potato production collapsed from 75 million tons to 23 million. Meat production dropped from 4.7 million tons to 1.8 million. These weren't marginal declines or temporary adjustments. This was agricultural collapse on a massive scale, occurring at the exact moment when demand for food was increasing dramatically as the nation mobilized for total war. The causes of this collapse were multiple and reinforcing. Obviously, the loss of agricultural territory to German occupation was huge, but production in areas still under Soviet control also suffered severely. Able-bodied men were conscripted into the Red Army by the millions, draining farms of their most productive workers. Tractors and trucks were requisitioned for military use, leaving farms without mechanization. Horses, the traditional motive power for Russian agriculture, were also taken for military transport. Fertilizer production ceased as chemical plants were converted to munitions manufacture or destroyed by German advances. The logistical network that moved inputs to farms and crops to cities broke down under the strain of military priorities and enemy action. Agricultural areas that remained in Soviet hands faced immediate threats of conquest. Farmers worked knowing German armies might overrun them at any moment. The Soviet government implemented scorched earth policies in threatened regions, ordering the evacuation or destruction of anything that might benefit the enemy. This included grain stores, livestock, farm equipment, entire collective farms. The policy made military sense, denying resources to advancing German forces, but it created terrible suffering for civilians and further reduced Soviet agricultural capacity. Women, children, and elderly people became the agricultural workforce. By 1943, women comprised the majority of workers on collective farms in many regions. They operated tractors when tractors were available, plowed with horses when horses remained, and sometimes pulled plows themselves when no draft animals could be found. Children barely into their teens worked adult jobs, their education postponed or abandoned entirely, as survival took precedence over everything else. The elderly, many of whom had witnessed revolution, civil war, collectivization, and famine, now faced war while trying to coax food from exhausted soil with minimal equipment and insufficient labor. The Soviet government recognized that agriculture was crucial to survival and military success. Farms were organized under command economy principles even more rigidly than before the war. Production quotas were set and had to be met regardless of conditions. Failure to deliver required amounts of grain or other products could result in severe punishment, including execution for sabotage. The system was brutal, but reflected the desperate circumstances. Every ton of grain mattered. Every pound of meat could mean the difference between a unit being combat-ready or too weakened by hunger to fight effectively. The government also tried to maximize production through intensive cultivation of any available land. Urban residents were encouraged, and in many cases required, to grow food. This wasn't the relatively voluntary victory garden movement seen in America and Britain. This was survival gardening on a massive scale driven by necessity rather than patriotic enthusiasm. Factory workers maintained plots near their workplaces. City dwellers turned parks and waste ground into vegetable patches. Even in Leningrad during the horrific siege, residents planted vegetables in any space that could support them, though precious little grew in a city where topsoil had been buried under rubble and where people were literally dying of starvation in the streets. Soviet kitchen gardens during the war represented the largest wartime mass gardening movement of any country. The government actively promoted individual garden plots, even though this conflicted with the ideological preference for collective agriculture. But pragmatism overrode ideology when survival was at stake. The government provided land, distributed seed when available, and encouraged every household to grow as much food as possible. These gardens became primary food sources for millions of Soviet citizens. Production from these individual plots was substantial. Though precise statistics are difficult to verify, estimates suggest that individual gardens produced nearly as much food as collective farms in some regions during the war years. This was a startling reversal of the collectivization program's stated goals. The small, intensively worked plots, tended by families growing food for their own survival, proved more productive per acre than the vast collective farms worked by conscripted labor under government orders. The Soviet government also organized collective gardens in urban areas. Trade unions, factories, and institutions were assigned land to cultivate. Workers were expected to contribute labor, producing vegetables that would supplement their diets or be used in factory canteens. The program was extensive but chaotic. Land assignments were often inappropriate, rocky or contaminated ground that required enormous effort to make productive. Tools and fertilizer were scarce or non-existent. Many workers, already exhausted from long shifts in factories producing war materials, had little energy left for agricultural labor. The situation in rural areas was often even worse than in cities. Collective farms that remained operational struggled with impossible demands. They were required to deliver specific quantities of crops to the state for military and urban consumption, while also producing enough to feed farm workers. In practice, this meant farmers often went hungry, so soldiers and factory workers could be fed. Malnutrition was widespread in rural areas during the war. Farmers who grew the food often had the least to eat, watching their harvests being shipped away while they survived on minimal rations. Soviet propaganda during the war emphasized agricultural production as essential to patriotic duty. Posters showed heroic tractor drivers and farm workers producing abundance for the motherland. The reality was far grimmer than the propaganda suggested, but the message had truth at its core. Soviet agriculture, however damaged and dysfunctional, had to keep producing. If the farms failed completely, the war was lost. The Germans could barely be fought and defeated by soldiers weakened by hunger. Agricultural survival in the Soviet Union ultimately depended heavily on American aid delivered through the Lend-Lease program. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped enormous quantities of food and agricultural supplies to the Soviet Union. This included approximately 4.5 million tons of food, along with tractors, trucks, and other equipment essential to agricultural production and food distribution. Soviet officials privately acknowledged that without this aid, the agricultural situation would have been completely catastrophic. Stalin himself reportedly told Khrushchev that Lend-Lease enabled the Soviet Union to continue fighting. The food situation in occupied territories presents its own complex and tragic story. German occupation policies varied considerably depending on location and purpose. In some areas, the Germans attempted to maintain agricultural production, recognizing they needed the food for their own military and civilian populations. Collective farms sometimes continued operating under German control, with production redirected to serve the occupation forces. Ukrainian grain, which had once fed Russia, now fed German soldiers and was shipped to Germany itself. In other areas, particularly where partisan activity was strong, German policy was deliberately destructive. Villages suspected of supporting partisans were burned, their inhabitants killed or deported, their fields left fallow or destroyed. The scorched earth ran both directions, Soviet forces destroying resources as they retreated, German forces destroying resources when they could no longer hold territory, and the land between suffered terribly. Farmers in occupied areas faced impossible choices. Cooperation with German authorities might ensure survival and might protect villages from reprisals. But it meant feeding the enemy, contributing to the German war effort that oppressed them. Resistance or sabotage could result in execution, not just of individuals, but of entire families or villages. Many farmers tried to walk a narrow line, providing enough to avoid severe punishment while holding back or hiding as much as they dared. Some joined partisan groups, abandoning farms to fight in forests and marshes. Others simply tried to survive day by day, caught between brutal occupiers and the promise of eventual liberation that seemed impossibly distant. The aftermath of German retreat often brought new agricultural devastation. The Germans typically destroyed everything they couldn't take with them. Buildings were burned, equipment was disabled or hauled away, livestock was slaughtered or driven west. Fields were sometimes sown with mines, making cultivation deadly. Returning Soviet authorities found agricultural infrastructure completely destroyed in many areas. Rebuilding would take years, but the war was still raging and production was needed immediately. Soviet agriculture limped through the war years, sustained by heroic efforts of workers, by aid from allies, by the exploitation of occupied territories, and by the ruthless prioritization of military needs over civilian welfare. Millions of Soviet civilians died from hunger and malnutrition during the war, a tragedy that receives less attention than military casualties, but was no less real and no less devastating. The agricultural workforce was damaged irreparably. Skilled farmers and agricultural scientists killed in fighting or purges, knowledge lost, communities destroyed. Yet somehow, impossibly, Soviet agriculture produced enough to sustain the military forces that eventually drove German armies back to Berlin. Soldiers marched west on rations that were often barely adequate, but they marched. Factories produced tanks and planes, staffed by workers who were chronically hungry, but the production continued. It was survival at terrible cost, achieved through suffering that defies easy comprehension. But it was survival nonetheless, and the agricultural workers who made it possible deserve recognition alongside the soldiers and generals whose names fill the history books. The Soviet agricultural experience during World War II represents the extreme end of wartime mobilization, a case study in how far a population can be pushed before complete collapse. It also demonstrates the crucial role of agricultural aid in sustaining allies, a lesson that shaped American policy and international agricultural development for decades after the war ended. But before we examine that aid in detail, we need to explore another crucial dimension of the agricultural labor story: the use of prisoners of war in American fields. A remarkable program that raises complex questions about international law, agricultural necessity, and the treatment of enemies. It sounds like something from a work of fiction. German soldiers, captured in the deserts of North Africa or the hedgerows of France, transported across the Atlantic to the American heartland, put to work harvesting wheat in Kansas, picking cotton in Texas, thinning sugar beets in Colorado. Yet this is exactly what happened. More than 400,000 Axis prisoners of war, primarily German, but also Italian and some Japanese, spent portions of World War II in camps scattered across the United States, and a significant portion of them worked in American agriculture. The program emerged from practical necessity combined with international obligation. The Geneva Conventions of 1929, which the United States had signed, established guidelines for the treatment of prisoners of war. These guidelines permitted the use of POW labor under specific conditions. Prisoners could not be forced to work in war-related industries. They must be paid for their labor, and officers could not be compelled to work at all. Agriculture fit these criteria perfectly. Farming wasn't directly related to military production in the way that manufacturing weapons or ammunition would be. It was essential civilian work, and it desperately needed workers. By 1943, American farms faced an acute labor crisis. As we've discussed, millions of farm workers had left for military service or better-paying industrial jobs. The Emergency Farm Labor Program mobilized various groups to fill the gap, but demand still exceeded supply. Meanwhile, POWs were arriving in the United States in increasing numbers. Early in the war, Britain had taken custody of German prisoners captured in North Africa, but British camps were overflowing, and Britain struggled to feed and house them adequately. The British government asked the United States to accept these prisoners, and America agreed. The first major influx came after the surrender of German forces in North Africa in May 1943. More than 150,000 prisoners arrived in the following months. After D-Day in June 1944, the numbers increased dramatically, averaging 30,000 new prisoners per month for the latter half of 1944 and 60,000 per month in early 1945. By war's end, roughly 425,000 enemy prisoners were held in 511 main and branch camps across the United States. Camp locations were chosen strategically. Government guidelines mandated placing camps away from urban areas and war industries for security reasons. Regions with mild climates were preferred to minimize construction costs, and critically, camps were established in areas where POWs could help alleviate anticipated farm labor shortages. This meant many camps were located in the south and southwest, but camps existed in 46 of the then 48 states. The camps themselves varied considerably in size and quality. Some held several thousand prisoners in facilities that resembled standard military barracks. Others were temporary installations housing just a few dozen prisoners in converted school buildings, abandoned civilian conservation course camps, or even circus tents. The commonality was barbed wire fencing, watchtowers, and guard posts that transformed ordinary buildings into detention facilities. Life in POW camps was generally comfortable compared to combat conditions or prisoner facilities in some other nations. The Geneva Conventions required equal treatment with the captor nation's own soldiers. So POWs received the same rations as American troops. They had access to medical care, recreational facilities, and educational opportunities. Many camps had sports teams, theater groups, orchestras composed of prisoner musicians. Some prisoners took correspondence courses through American universities, earning academic credits that would be recognized when they returned to Germany. This relatively good treatment created controversy. Many Americans, reading casualty lists and seeing news of German atrocities, resented what they saw as coddling of the enemy. Letters poured into the War Department complaining about POW conditions, with some citizens demanding prisoners be executed rather than housed and fed. The government struggled to explain that treating prisoners well made it more likely that Germany would reciprocate with American POWs. It was pragmatic self-interest, not soft-heartedness, though this rationale didn't satisfy everyone. The agricultural work program began in fall of 1943 and expanded rapidly. Prisoners were assigned to work on farms, in canneries, in food processing plants. The typical arrangement involved farmers contracting with the government to receive POW workers. Farmers paid the government the prevailing wage for farm labor, which varied by region but averaged around $1.50 per day. The prisoner himself received 80 cents daily in the form of canteen coupons that could be used to purchase items like toiletries, tobacco, snacks, writing materials. The difference went to the federal treasury to help offset the costs of the POW program. A typical workday for POW farm workers began early. Prisoners were transported from camps to work sites, often traveling 30 or 40 miles. Armed guards accompanied them, though the guard-to-prisoner ratio was usually quite low. The actual work matched whatever agricultural tasks needed doing. In sugar beet country, POWs thinned and weeded young plants in spring, then harvested the heavy roots in fall. In wheat regions, they helped with harvest during the critical weeks when grain had to be cut, threshed, and stored before weather could damage it. In orchards, they picked apples, peaches, oranges. In cotton fields, they chopped weeds and picked bolls. The productivity of POW labor varied considerably and presented challenges. Language barriers complicated instruction and supervision. Some prisoners were skilled agricultural workers from farming backgrounds in Germany, but many were city dwellers with no farm experience. Motivation varied widely. Some POWs, grateful to be away from combat and relatively well treated, worked diligently. Others, particularly those still loyal to Nazi ideology, engaged in passive resistance or outright sabotage, working slowly, damaging equipment, wasting resources. Farmers who used POW labor had mixed reactions. Many spoke positively of their POW workers, praising their diligence and skill. Some farmers maintained friendships with former POWs for years after the war, exchanging letters, even visiting each other. In some rural communities, POWs were invited to family dinners, allowed to attend church services, treated as guests rather than enemies. These interactions humanized the enemy in ways that complicated simple narratives of good versus evil. Other farmers found POW labor frustrating and unsatisfactory. The indirect relationship, where farmers paid the government rather than workers directly, created distance. If workers performed poorly, farmers had limited recourse. They couldn't fire individuals or adjust pay rates. They had to work through military bureaucracy that moved slowly and sometimes seemed indifferent to agricultural needs. And there was always the security concern, the awareness that these men, however friendly they might seem, were enemy soldiers who might escape or commit violence. Security incidents were remarkably rare given the scale of the program. Of the more than 400,000 POWs in the United States during the war, only about 2,200, less than 1%, attempted escape. Most were recaptured quickly. The difficulty of blending into American society, combined with the vast distances to neutral territory, made successful escape nearly impossible. POWs who did escape usually surrendered within days or weeks, hungry and desperate. The relatively good treatment in camps and work programs reduced motivation to flee. Why risk it when you were well fed, relatively safe, and reasonably comfortable? The political complexity of the POW workforce shouldn't be underestimated. Many German POWs were committed Nazis, true believers who maintained faith in Hitler and the Reich even after capture. These men sometimes attempted to impose Nazi discipline on other prisoners, threatening or even attacking those they saw as traitors or defeatists. Camp commanders struggled with this dynamic, trying to separate hardcore Nazis from other prisoners, while maintaining order and getting work done. The United States attempted a re-education program for German POWs, officially called the Special Projects Division. Beginning in fall 1943, this program published a prison newspaper, distributed books banned in Nazi Germany, and later offered intensive courses on democracy for selected prisoners. The goal was to prepare POWs to return to Germany with democratic values and help rebuild German society after the war. The program's effectiveness is debatable. Many prisoners rejected it outright. Others participated but remained committed to their previous beliefs. Some were genuinely influenced, though whether by the re-education program or simply by prolonged exposure to American life is unclear. The agricultural contribution of POW labor was significant but not overwhelming. Estimates suggest POW workers contributed several percent of total agricultural labor during peak years. In specific crops and regions, the contribution was more substantial. Sugar beet production, for example, relied heavily on POW labor in states like Colorado and Nebraska. Without POWs, some crops would have rotted in fields for lack of harvesters. The work changed the POWs themselves in interesting ways. Many had never been to America before and had absorbed Nazi propaganda about the United States being culturally degenerate, economically weak, and racially inferior. Working on American farms, living in American communities, eating American food, and interacting with American people challenged these stereotypes. Some prisoners wrote letters home describing America's abundance and agricultural productivity with barely concealed envy. Others maintained ideological blinders, interpreting everything through the lens of propaganda. African Americans and POWs sometimes worked side by side in fields, creating surreal situations where German prisoners enjoyed better treatment than American citizens. POWs could eat in restaurants that refused service to Black Americans. They could stay in hotels that excluded African Americans. They could use facilities that were segregated against American citizens of color. This wasn't lost on Black Americans, who noted bitterly that enemy soldiers received courtesies denied to them. The contradictions highlighted America's racial injustices in ways that contributed to civil rights momentum in the post-war years. The end of the war created new complications for POW labor. Germany surrendered in May 1945, but POWs weren't immediately repatriated. The Geneva Conventions technically required prompt repatriation after hostilities ended, but the reality was more complex. Europe was devastated, barely able to feed existing populations. Immediately sending hundreds of thousands of additional people back seemed unwise. Meanwhile, American agriculture still needed workers. Labor shortages hadn't disappeared just because the war had ended. The United States kept German POWs working through 1946 despite protests from some quarters that this violated international law. By 1947, most had been repatriated, though the final POWs didn't leave until early 1948, nearly 3 years after Germany's surrender. Many returned to find Germany destroyed, cities in ruins, food scarce, their families scattered or dead. Some had developed such positive views of America that they sought to immigrate legally, eventually returning as permanent residents or citizens. The POW labor program raises difficult questions that don't have simple answers. Was it exploitation to use prisoner labor, even with payment? Did it violate the spirit, if not the letter, of the Geneva Conventions? Or was it a reasonable response to practical necessity that treated prisoners better than most POWs experienced elsewhere? The questions persist because the answers depend on values and perspectives that vary among individuals and across time. What's clear is that the program represented a unique moment in agricultural history. Enemy soldiers, captured on distant battlefields, transported across an ocean, put to work growing food in a country most had never imagined visiting. They planted and harvested crops that fed American civilians and soldiers, contributing to the very war effort that had defeated them. It was pragmatic, strange, sometimes troubling, occasionally moving, and always complicated. It was also effective, helping sustain American agricultural production at a critical moment when all conventional labor sources had been exhausted. The POW labor story is just one part of the broader labor mobilization that characterized wartime agriculture. Understanding the full picture requires examining not only who worked the fields, but also how they worked them, what tools and techniques they employed, and how rapidly agricultural technology evolved under the pressure of war's demands. Picture a farmer in 1939, and you'll likely imagine someone walking behind a horse-drawn plow, working with tools and techniques that would have been familiar to farmers a century earlier. Picture that same farmer in 1946, and the scene transforms dramatically. Now there's a tractor, a mechanical harvester, perhaps even an airplane spraying pesticides overhead. The war compressed decades of agricultural innovation into just a few years, fundamentally changing not just who worked on farms, but how that work was done. Mechanization was the most visible transformation. Tractors existed before the war, but their adoption accelerated dramatically during the conflict. In the United States, the number of tractors on farms increased from approximately 1.6 million in 1940 to 2.4 million by 1945. This 67% increase represented more than just numbers. It represented a fundamental shift in how farms operated and what they could accomplish. The tractor transformed agricultural productivity in multiple ways. A farmer with a tractor could plow, plant, and harvest far more acreage than one relying on horses or mules. This increased capacity was crucial when labor was scarce. One person with a tractor could do work that previously required several workers with animal-drawn equipment. The math was simple but profound. Fewer workers plus better equipment equaled more production. It was the equation that made wartime agricultural demands achievable. But getting tractors and keeping them running presented serious challenges. Farm equipment manufacturers faced competing demands. The government needed their factories to produce tanks, trucks, and other military vehicles. Farmers needed them to produce tractors and harvesters. The conflict couldn't be fully resolved, only managed through priority systems and compromises. The War Production Board, responsible for allocating industrial capacity, had to balance these needs carefully. They limited civilian tractor production, but didn't eliminate it entirely. Farmers deemed most critical to food production received priority for new equipment. Others had to make do with what they had, nursing aging machinery through one more season. Agricultural extension agents taught repair and maintenance workshops, helping farmers keep equipment functioning with limited access to replacement parts. The scarcity of new equipment created a robust market for used tractors and implements. Farmers traded and sold equipment among themselves. Auctions became important events where desperate farmers bid against each other for worn machines. Prices rose well above pre-war levels as scarcity drove demand. Some dealers engaged in black market activities, selling equipment at inflated prices or demanding under-the-table payments. The government tried to control prices, but enforcement was difficult. Material shortages affected equipment in various ways. Rubber for tires became critically scarce as Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia cut off natural rubber supplies. Synthetic rubber production increased, but couldn't fully replace natural rubber for all applications. Some farmers fitted steel wheels to tractors and other equipment, returning to technology from the early days of mechanization. Steel wheels damaged roads and made operation less comfortable, but they worked when rubber couldn't be obtained. Manufacturers adapted by using alternative materials. Some equipment incorporated aluminum instead of steel, utilizing surplus aluminum from aircraft production. Others used pressed steel in place of heavier cast iron components. The designs weren't always ideal, but they kept production moving when traditional materials were unavailable. Maintenance became more critical than ever. Farm equipment that might have been replaced after a few years of heavy use had to last much longer. Farmers learned to perform repairs that previously would have been left to specialists. They improvised parts, adapted equipment for different uses, and generally became more resourceful. This self-reliance built skills that persisted long after the war ended. Mechanization wasn't evenly distributed across agricultural regions or types of farming. Large wheat farms in the Great Plains had the greatest access to and need for mechanized equipment. The scale of operation justified significant investment in tractors and combines. Cotton production in the South, traditionally dependent on massive labor inputs for planting and especially harvesting, remained less mechanized during the war years. Mechanical cotton pickers existed, but weren't widespread until after the war. Fruit and vegetable crops similarly required substantial hand labor for harvesting, as mechanical harvesters for these crops were still being developed. The type of mechanization mattered as much as the fact of it. Combines, which cut and threshed grain in a single operation, represented massive labor savings compared to older methods that required separate cutting, binding, shocking, and threshing operations. A combine with a two-person crew could harvest what previously required a threshing crew of a dozen or more workers. During wartime labor shortages, this efficiency was essential, but combines were expensive and complex machines requiring skill to operate and maintain. They also required relatively large acreages to justify their cost. Small farmers often couldn't afford combines individually. Custom harvesting operations, where owners of combines contracted to harvest multiple farms in succession, became more common. These operations would follow the harvest north, starting in Texas or Oklahoma and moving through Kansas, Nebraska, and eventually into North Dakota and Montana as wheat ripened in different regions. Chemical inputs transformed agriculture as profoundly as mechanical equipment, though in less visible ways. Synthetic fertilizers, particularly nitrogen-based products, allowed farmers to boost yields substantially. Before the war, many farmers still relied primarily on manure and crop rotation to maintain soil fertility. Synthetic fertilizers offered a more concentrated, more easily applied alternative. They didn't replace organic methods entirely, but they supplemented them, enabling the intensive production required by wartime demands. The chemical industry that produced fertilizers was the same industry that produced explosives. The Haber-Bosch process for fixing atmospheric nitrogen, developed before World War I, could produce both ammonia for fertilizer and nitrates for explosives. During the war, most nitrogen production went to military uses, but some continued flowing to agriculture because food production was also essential to the war effort. Farmers often found fertilizers scarce and had to apply them strategically to the most important crops. Pesticides underwent similar development. DDT, which would become controversial decades later for its environmental effects, was developed as an insecticide during the war years. The military used it extensively to control disease-carrying insects like mosquitoes and lice. By 1943, American factories were producing 3 million pounds of DDT per month. The chemical was highly effective at killing insects and seemed to pose no immediate danger to humans. Just 3 days before the war's end, DDT was released for civilian use, including agricultural applications. Other pesticides and herbicides also became more widely used during the war years. Lead arsenate and nicotine sulfate helped control crop pests. Bordeaux mixture, a combination of copper sulfate and lime, fought fungal diseases. These chemicals weren't new, most had existed for years, but their application became more systematic and widespread as agriculture intensified. The increased use of chemicals raised questions even during the war, though these concerns were generally subordinated to production demands. Some farmers and agricultural scientists worried about effects on soil health and beneficial insects. But with production pressures, overwhelming and alternative methods often unavailable, chemical solutions became standard practice on many farms. Irrigation technology also advanced significantly. Regions with adequate rainfall could rely on natural precipitation, but areas with limited or unreliable rainfall needed irrigation to maximize production. The war years saw expansion of irrigation infrastructure in the western United States. Dams and reservoirs built partially or entirely with federal funding expanded irrigated acreage. Pumping technology improved, making it economically feasible to irrigate land that previously had been too expensive to water. Center pivot irrigation, which would revolutionize farming in arid regions, was still in development during the war years. But the groundwork was being laid for post-war expansion of irrigated agriculture. Engineers experimented with different designs for moving irrigation systems that could cover large areas efficiently. The wartime emphasis on maximizing production from every available acre created urgency around solving irrigation challenges. Information and knowledge transfer accelerated during the war. The Agricultural Extension Service expanded its reach and intensified its efforts. County agents worked overtime distributing information about new techniques, seed varieties, and pest management. Farmers who might have been skeptical of new methods in peacetime were more willing to experiment when production quotas and patriotic duty demanded maximum output. Publications aimed at farmers increased circulation and expanded content. Farm journals published articles about wartime agricultural techniques, labor-saving methods, equipment maintenance, and crop planning. Radio programs offered regular agricultural advice tailored to seasonal needs and regional conditions. The government produced pamphlets and bulletins distributed free to farmers, covering everything from soil conservation to livestock management. Research institutions pivoted toward wartime agricultural needs. Agricultural experiment stations tested new crop varieties, developed improved production techniques, and solved problems that farmers reported. The cooperative extension system, linking land-grant universities with local communities, proved its value by rapidly disseminating research findings. A discovery made at an experiment station in Iowa might be tested on farms in Kansas within weeks, and adopted across the region within months if it proved effective. Hybrid seed represented a particularly important technological advance. Hybrid corn, developed in the 1930s but not yet universally adopted, offered yields 20 to 30% higher than traditional open-pollinated varieties. The war accelerated hybrid adoption because the yield advantage mattered more when every bushel counted. By 1945, hybrid corn was planted on most corn acreage in the United States. Similar breeding work with wheat, soybeans, and other crops yielded varieties better, suited to intensive production. The seeds of the Green Revolution, which would transform global agriculture in the post-war decades, were being planted literally and figuratively during World War II. The intensive research, the emphasis on maximizing yields through scientific breeding and chemical inputs, the mechanization of previously manual tasks, all these trends that would characterize agricultural development from the 1950s onward had their origins in wartime mobilization. Not all technological changes were positive or sustainable. Intensive cultivation without adequate attention to soil conservation led to erosion problems in some regions. The expansion of monoculture cropping, planting the same crop repeatedly on the same land, depleted soil nutrients and increased vulnerability to pests and diseases. Chemical inputs, while boosting yields in the short term, created dependencies that would shape agriculture for generations. The environmental costs of wartime agricultural intensification wouldn't become fully apparent until decades later, but in the moment, these concerns were secondary to production. Farmers were asked to grow as much as possible, as quickly as possible, using whatever tools and methods worked. The technological transformation of agriculture during the war years met those demands. Farms became more productive, more mechanized, more chemically intensive, more scientifically managed. The changes were profound and largely irreversible. When the war ended, agriculture didn't revert to pre-war methods. Instead, the trends accelerated, creating the industrial agricultural system that dominates global food production to this day. While much attention focuses on agricultural mobilization in Europe and North America, the war's agricultural dimensions in Asia present an equally important, if more complex story. The Japanese Empire's agricultural situation shaped its strategic decisions and influenced how the war unfolded across the Pacific and throughout East and Southeast Asia. Food wasn't simply a logistical concern for Japan. It was an existential challenge that drove military strategy and ultimately contributed to defeat. Japan in 1941 faced fundamental agricultural limitations. The archipelago consists of mountainous islands with limited arable land. Only 10 to 15% of the total land area could support agriculture. This contrasts sharply with countries like China, where approximately 50% of land is suitable for farming. Japan's large and growing population, concentrated in industrial cities, depended heavily on food imports. Before the war, Japan imported rice from Korea and Taiwan, wheat from Australia and North America, and various other foods from throughout its trading network. The decision to launch the Pacific War was influenced significantly by food concerns. Japan's leaders believed they needed control over the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia to ensure food security and access to raw materials. The so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was presented as Pan-Asian cooperation, but practically it meant Japanese exploitation of agricultural and natural resources from conquered territories. Rice from Burma, Thailand, and Indochina would feed Japanese soldiers and civilians. Sugar from the Philippines, rubber and tin from Malaya, oil from the Dutch East Indies, all these resources motivated Japanese expansion. The early months of the war seemed to validate this strategy. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia with stunning speed, capturing territories that should have secured Japan's food supply. But controlling territory and actually getting food from it proved very different. The logistical challenge of transporting food from occupied lands to Japan required merchant shipping, the same ships needed to supply military forces scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. American submarines soon made this transport increasingly dangerous and eventually nearly impossible. The American submarine campaign, often overshadowed by more dramatic aspects of the Pacific War, was devastatingly effective. Between December 1941 and July 1945, American submarines sank more than 2,000 Japanese ships totaling nearly 7.5 million tons. Each sinking represented not just military supplies, but also food that would never reach Japan. Rice harvested in Burma couldn't feed Tokyo if the ship carrying it lay on the ocean floor. Domestic Japanese agricultural production declined during the war for multiple reasons. Young men were conscripted into military service, draining farms of workers just as in other warring nations. But Japan's situation was more precarious because farms were small and labor-intensive, averaging just a few acres per family. There was no mechanization to offset labor losses. Farm work became the responsibility of women, children, and elderly people, groups already contributing, but now carrying the entire burden. Fertilizer production declined as chemical plants were diverted to military uses. Without adequate fertilizer, yields dropped. Tools and equipment became scarce and couldn't be replaced. Draft animals, particularly horses, were requisitioned for military use. Even basic items like rope and buckets grew scarce as materials were redirected to war industries. Japanese farmers found themselves trying to maintain production with decreasing resources and increasing demands. Weather added its own complications. Poor harvests in 1944 and 1945 reduced grain production further, just when it was most desperately needed. Without imports to buffer domestic shortages, these crop failures translated directly into hunger. The fishing industry, traditionally an important protein source, also collapsed. Fishing boats were requisitioned for military use or destroyed by American attacks. Fuel for remaining boats became unavailable. The catch declined by roughly 50% during the war. The Japanese government attempted to manage food supplies through rationing systems similar to those in other nations. But Japanese rationing was both stricter and less effective than in Britain or America. By 1945, the official ration provided only about 1,500 calories per day, barely subsistence level. And even these meager rations couldn't always be delivered. The American strategic bombing campaign, which intensified in late 1944 and early 1945, destroyed Japan's transportation infrastructure. Rail lines were disrupted, roads were bombed, shipping between islands became impossible. Food might exist in one region, while people starved in another, with no way to move it. Urban populations suffered most severely. City dwellers depended entirely on food distribution systems that were breaking down. Factory workers received reduced rations that left them chronically hungry and weak. Production in war industries declined not just because of bombing and material shortages, but also because workers lacked the physical strength to maintain output. Children saw their daily rations reduced from approximately 19 ounces in 1943 to just 14 ounces by 1945. Malnutrition became widespread. Disease increased as weakened immune systems couldn't fight off infections. The government encouraged urban residents to leave cities for the countryside, where food was theoretically more available. Hundreds of thousands of children were evacuated, sent to live with relatives in rural areas or housed in temples and inns. But rural areas weren't abundant either. Farmers themselves were often hungry, required to surrender most of their harvest to government requisitions while surviving on minimal rations. Evacuated children frequently found conditions in the countryside barely better than in cities. School athletic fields were converted to vegetable gardens. Families ate every part of plants they could digest, leaves, stems, roots. Nothing was wasted. People consumed insects for protein, beetles and beetle larvae roasted or mashed. Sweet potato vines, normally discarded or used for animal feed, became human food. The definition of edible expanded as hunger intensified. Propaganda attempted to maintain morale by emphasizing patriotic duty and promising eventual victory. But propaganda couldn't fill empty stomachs. People knew they were hungry and getting hungrier. They saw food shortages worsening month by month. By mid-1945, Japan was approaching agricultural and food collapse. Had the war continued into the winter of 1945 to 1946, as seemed likely before the atomic bombings and Soviet invasion forced surrender, millions of Japanese civilians would likely have starved to death. Occupied territories experienced their own agricultural tragedies under Japanese rule. Japanese occupation policies varied by location, but generally prioritized Japanese needs over local populations. In Korea, rice production was maintained or even increased, but most was shipped to Japan. Koreans themselves survived on less rice, forced to supplement with inferior grains or other foods. The system was exploitative and resented, contributing to Korean nationalism and resistance. In Southeast Asia, Japanese forces initially tried to maintain agricultural production in occupied territories. The rice paddies of Burma, Thailand, and Indochina continued operating under Japanese control. But the disruption of war, the diversion of labor to military projects, and the breakdown of normal commercial relationships reduced output. Local populations often faced food shortages, even in traditionally rice surplus regions. The Bengal famine of 1943, which killed millions in British-ruled India, had connections to Japanese military actions. The Japanese conquest of Burma cut off rice supplies that had previously fed Bengal. British authorities failed to respond adequately, prioritizing military needs and showing callous indifference to civilian suffering. The famine demonstrated how war could create humanitarian catastrophes far from battlefields, as disrupted trade patterns and military priorities combined with natural disasters to produce mass starvation. In China, where Japanese forces had been fighting since 1937, agricultural disruption was severe. Combat destroyed farmland, killed farmers, and disrupted the cycles of planting and harvest. The Japanese army's 3 alls policy, kill all, burn all, loot all, deliberately destroyed agricultural resources in areas suspected of supporting Chinese resistance. Entire villages were wiped out, their fields salted or burned, their populations massacred or displaced. The human cost was incalculable. Chinese resistance depended partly on agricultural resilience. Communist forces in particular emphasized agricultural self-sufficiency, establishing base areas where land reform and cooperative farming provided food security. The ability of Chinese forces to sustain themselves through local agricultural production frustrated Japanese attempts to control the countryside through conventional military means. Food became a weapon in the war, with both sides trying to deny agricultural resources to the enemy while securing them for their own use. The post-war food situation in Japan was dire. Surrender brought peace but not immediate relief from hunger. Domestic production was at low levels. The loss of Korea and Taiwan as rice sources eliminated millions of tons of imports. The repatriation of 8 million Japanese from former colonies and occupied territories added mouths to feed. The 1945 harvest was poor. Allied occupation authorities found themselves responsible for feeding a population on the edge of starvation. American food aid prevented mass famine in post-war Japan. The United States shipped food to Japan, partly for humanitarian reasons, but also for strategic ones. A starving Japan might turn to communism, which American policymakers feared. Food aid helped stabilize Japan and facilitated the occupation and reconstruction. The school lunch programs established during the occupation, which provided milk and bread to Japanese children, had lasting effects on Japanese dietary patterns and agriculture. The Japanese agricultural experience during World War II illustrates how agricultural limitations can drive strategic decisions and how the disruption of agricultural systems can threaten entire societies. Japan's inability to feed itself from domestic resources and its failure to secure reliable food supplies from conquered territories contributed materially to defeat. Soldiers weakened by hunger couldn't fight effectively. Workers, too malnourished to maintain production, couldn't keep war industries running. Civilian populations near starvation couldn't sustain the home front morale necessary for total war. The agricultural dimensions of the Pacific War demonstrate that food security is a fundamental strategic concern, not a secondary issue to be addressed after military and industrial needs are met. Nations that cannot feed themselves face vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit. The lesson wasn't lost on post-war leaders and would shape agricultural development policies for decades to come. Food during World War II was more than sustenance. It was a strategic weapon deployed with sophistication equal to any military technology. Nations tried to feed their own populations while starving enemies. They used food as diplomatic currency, strengthening alliances and influencing neutral powers. The management of food supplies, through rationing systems, agricultural aid programs, and naval blockades, shaped the war's course as surely as any battle. Rationing was implemented by virtually every major combatant nation, each system reflecting national circumstances and governmental philosophies. Britain's rationing system, perhaps the most thoroughly studied, began in January 1940 with butter, sugar, and bacon. Additional foods were added progressively until by 1942, almost everything except vegetables and bread was rationed. The system was comprehensive, bureaucratic, and remarkably fair. Everyone, regardless of wealth or status, received the same basic rations. The only exceptions were for heavy workers who needed additional calories or pregnant women who needed extra nutrition. British rationing worked through a registration system. Households registered with specific shops, which then received allocations to serve their registered customers. Ration books contained coupons that had to be surrendered when purchasing rationed items. The coupons were dated and specific, creating a system that was difficult to cheat. Black market activity existed, but was relatively limited compared to some other nations. The weekly ration for an adult in Britain provided bare sufficiency but little comfort or variety. The quantities we mentioned earlier, 1 egg, 2 ounces of butter, 4 ounces of bacon represented meals. Stripped to essentials, the psychological effect of rationing shouldn't be underestimated. People accustomed to choice and abundance found themselves making do with monotony and scarcity. Simple pleasures like sugar in tea or butter on bread became luxuries. Meat became so scarce that finding ways to stretch it occupied significant mental energy. The British government worked hard to make rationing palatable and to extract maximum nutrition from limited supplies. The Ministry of Food employed home economists and nutritionists to develop recipes that made rationed foods appealing or at least acceptable. Radio programs taught housewives how to cook with limited ingredients. Newspapers published recipes weekly. Celebrity chefs were enlisted to demonstrate that rationed meals could be tasty and nutritious. Interestingly, the health effects of British rationing were largely positive. The population was generally healthier and better nourished during the war than before it. Rationing ensured everyone received adequate nutrition, even the poor who previously couldn't afford sufficient food. The emphasis on vegetables from victory gardens added nutrients to diets. The limitation on sugar and fats, while resented, actually improved health outcomes. Infant mortality declined during the war years. This doesn't mean rationing was pleasant or that people didn't suffer from it, but it demonstrates that a well-managed rationing system prioritizing nutrition over abundance can achieve positive results. American rationing was less comprehensive than British, but still significant. Sugar was the first item rationed, beginning in May 1942. Coffee, meat, fats and oils, cheese and canned goods followed. Gasoline and rubber were rationed to conserve resources for military use. The rationing system used a point system where different items cost different numbers of points based on availability and demand. Each family received ration books with stamps worth specific points. They could allocate their points as they chose within the limits, creating some flexibility. American rationing created less hardship than British because the United States had greater abundance. American farms produced far more food per capita than British farms. Geographic isolation meant America didn't face bombing or invasion that disrupted agriculture. The rationing was preventive rather than reactive, designed to ensure adequate supplies for military needs and lend-lease commitments rather than to stave off starvation. Most Americans ate less well than before the war, but weren't truly hungry. Soviet rationing was harsh and often ineffective. The system attempted to prioritize workers in essential industries and soldiers while providing minimal support to others. In practice, rationing frequently broke down. Promised rations didn't arrive. Distribution systems failed. People in besieged cities like Leningrad received rations that provided only a few hundred calories daily, far below survival levels. Millions of Soviet civilians died from hunger during the war, despite rationing systems that theoretically should have prevented mass starvation. German rationing began early and became increasingly severe as the war progressed. Initially, rationing was relatively generous, supplemented by food confiscated from occupied territories, but as territories were lost and domestic production declined, rations were reduced repeatedly. By war's end, German civilians were surviving on minimal calories. The Nazi regime's racial ideology influenced rationing, with Jews and other persecuted groups receiving lower rations or being excluded from rationing systems entirely, a deliberate policy of starvation as genocide. Naval blockades represented food as a weapon in its most direct form. Britain's survival depended on keeping sea lanes open for imports. Germany's U-boat campaign aimed to starve Britain into submission by sinking merchant ships. The Battle of the Atlantic was fundamentally about food as much as military supplies. Every convoy that reached Britain safely meant thousands of tons of grain, meat, fruit, and other foods that would sustain the British population for another few weeks. The U-boat campaign came terrifyingly close to success. At its peak in early 1943, German submarines were sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. Had this continued, Britain would have faced genuine starvation within months. The eventual Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, achieved through better convoy tactics, improved anti-submarine warfare technology, and breaking German naval codes, was as crucial as any land battle. It ensured Britain could be fed and supplied. Germany and Japan both attempted to use food as a weapon against enemies. In occupied territories, food was requisitioned and shipped to Germany or Japan, often leaving local populations on the edge of starvation. The deliberate starvation of populations in concentration camps and prisoner of war facilities represented the most extreme use of food deprivation as a tool of oppression and genocide. The Hunger Plan, a Nazi scheme to starve millions of Soviet civilians to death to free up food for German consumption, was attempted in occupied Soviet territories with devastating results. Lend-Lease represented food as a positive weapon, used to strengthen allies rather than weaken enemies. The program's scale was extraordinary. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States provided roughly $50 billion worth of supplies to Allied nations, equivalent to about $690 billion in current dollars. Food constituted a significant portion of these shipments. The Soviet Union received approximately 4.5 million tons of food under Lend-Lease, along with agricultural equipment, trucks for food distribution, and other supplies essential to feeding the population and military. This aid was crucial. Soviet agricultural production had collapsed, and without American food shipments, widespread famine would have occurred even in areas not under German occupation. Soviet leaders acknowledged privately that Lend-Lease food kept the nation fighting. Britain received American food in vast quantities. Approximately 10% of Britain's overall food supply during the war years came through Lend-Lease. This included bacon, eggs, cheese, fruit juices, and other items that supplemented domestic production and rationed supplies. The food arrived alongside weapons, vehicles, and industrial materials, all contributing to Britain's ability to continue the war. China received Lend-Lease food and agricultural supplies, though in smaller quantities than Britain or the Soviet Union. The logistical challenges of delivering supplies to China were immense, requiring either the dangerous airlift over the Himalayas or shipment through Burma when routes were open. Despite these difficulties, American aid helped sustain Chinese resistance against Japan. The provision of agricultural equipment as Lend-Lease aid had long-term effects beyond immediate food production. Tractors shipped to the Soviet Union helped mechanize Soviet agriculture. British farms received equipment that increased productivity. These shipments transferred technology and demonstrated agricultural methods that would influence post-war agricultural development. Food aid also served diplomatic purposes. Nations receiving American food became dependent on that aid, giving the United States influence over their policies. The aid created goodwill and demonstrated American productive capacity. It showed uncommitted nations which side had the resources to sustain a long war. Food became soft power, building alliances and shaping the post-war order. The management of food supplies required sophisticated planning and coordination. Planners had to balance competing demands, feeding civilian populations adequately to maintain morale and productivity, feeding military forces sufficient calories for combat effectiveness, providing aid to allies to keep them in the war, and maintaining reserves for contingencies. The calculations involved agricultural production forecasts, shipping capacity assessments, nutritional requirements, and strategic priorities. The United States benefited from geographic advantages that made food management easier. Abundant, productive farmland, protection from invasion, and spare industrial capacity allowed America to feed itself, its military, and its allies. But even America couldn't meet every demand. Choices had to be made about allocations. Some allies received more than others based on strategic importance and need. The food weapon worked in multiple directions. Nations used food to strengthen themselves and their allies while trying to deny it to enemies. Successful management of food resources contributed to victory just as surely as successful military operations. The Allies, particularly the United States, had advantages in agricultural capacity that proved decisive. The Axis powers, particularly Germany and Japan, faced food limitations that contributed materially to their defeats. The agricultural mobilization of World War II demonstrated that modern warfare requires not just military forces, but entire societies organized for production and sacrifice. Food production and distribution became military operations conducted by civilians. The farmlands and gardens became battlefields where victory was measured in tons of grain and pounds of vegetables. Understanding this agricultural dimension is essential to understanding how World War II was fought and ultimately won. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world was exhausted, traumatized, and fundamentally changed. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead. Political boundaries were redrawn. But less visible, equally profound transformations had occurred in agriculture. The war years had compressed decades of agricultural evolution into half a decade of frantic innovation and adaptation. The changes would shape how humanity feeds itself for generations to come. The most immediate post-war agricultural challenge was preventing mass starvation. Europe was devastated. Agricultural infrastructure had been destroyed across vast territories. Livestock herds were depleted. Farm equipment was broken or worn out. Farmers themselves were dead, disabled, or displaced. The continent that had been home to sophisticated agricultural systems now struggled to feed itself. Asia faced similar challenges. China had endured years of brutal warfare. Japan's agricultural system was in collapse. Southeast Asia was emerging from occupation with damaged infrastructure and disrupted markets. The United States emerged from the war with agricultural capacity far exceeding domestic needs. American farms had geared up to feed the world during wartime, and couldn't immediately scale back without causing economic disruption. The solution was continued food aid to devastated nations. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, included substantial agricultural assistance to Europe. Food shipments continued to Japan and other allies. American agriculture remained in high production mode, transitioning from wartime mobilization to post-war aid and commercial export. This agricultural abundance had strategic dimensions. American policymakers believed that hungry populations might turn to communism, which was spreading across Eastern Europe and competing for influence in Asia. Food aid was humanitarian, but also strategic, using American agricultural productivity as a tool of diplomacy and containment. The policy succeeded in its immediate goals. Western Europe avoided famine and maintained political stability. Japan, fed by American aid, became a stable democracy and ally rather than turning to communism. The technological changes accelerated during the war didn't reverse when peace came. Mechanization continued spreading. The number of tractors and other farm equipment increased steadily. Farms grew larger as mechanization allowed individual farmers to work more land. Small farms that had been viable with animal power and hand labor became economically marginal in an era of tractors and combines. Agricultural consolidation, the trend toward fewer, larger farms, accelerated throughout the developed world. Chemical agriculture, the reliance on synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, became standard practice on most farms. The war had demonstrated that these inputs could dramatically boost yields. Post-war agricultural policy in most countries emphasized production and productivity above other concerns. Maximizing output per acre became the primary goal. Chemical inputs were the most readily available tool to achieve that goal. The Green Revolution, which would transform agriculture in developing countries from the 1950s through the 1970s, had its roots in wartime agricultural mobilization. Norman Borlaug, who would become the father of the Green Revolution, began his work in Mexico in 1944, developing disease-resistant, high-yield wheat varieties. His approach emphasized hybrid seeds, chemical fertilizers, controlled irrigation, and scientific management, the same combination that had enabled wartime production increases in the United States. The Green Revolution exported this model globally. International agencies, funded largely by the United States and other Western nations, promoted high-yield crop varieties and the intensive farming methods required to achieve those yields. The approach was tremendously successful in increasing food production. India, which had faced recurrent famines, became self-sufficient in grain production. Mexico transformed from wheat importer to wheat exporter. Rice production in Asia increased dramatically. But the Green Revolution also created new problems and dependencies. The high-yield seeds required substantial inputs of fertilizer, water, and pesticides to achieve their potential. Small farmers who couldn't afford these inputs couldn't benefit from the new varieties. Wealth concentration increased in many rural areas as larger, better capitalized farmers prospered while smaller farmers struggled. Environmental concerns emerged as intensive chemical use degraded soil quality and contaminated water supplies. Monoculture cropping, planting vast areas with single varieties, increased vulnerability to pests and diseases. The social changes in agriculture that had occurred during the war also proved largely irreversible. Women had demonstrated their capacity to perform virtually any agricultural task. After the war, many women left farm work to return to other occupations or domestic roles, but the precedent had been set. Women's participation in agriculture, while it declined from wartime peaks, remained higher than before the war in most countries. More importantly, cultural attitudes had shifted. The idea that women couldn't or shouldn't do farm work had been thoroughly debunked. Mechanization and technological change reduced the need for agricultural labor. In the United States, farm population continued declining through the post-war decades. People left rural areas for cities and suburbs. By the 1980s, fewer than 3% of Americans lived on farms, compared to roughly 25% in 1940. Similar trends occurred in other developed nations. Agriculture became more productive while employing far fewer people. This demographic shift created new economic and social patterns. Rural communities declined as young people moved to cities. Small towns that had served agricultural hinterlands struggled as farms consolidated and populations thinned. The cultural divide between rural and urban areas, still visible today, deepened as fewer people had direct connection to agricultural work or rural life. Internationally, agricultural trade patterns established during the war persisted and expanded. The United States became the world's dominant agricultural exporter, feeding nations that couldn't or wouldn't produce sufficient food domestically. This created economic benefits for American farmers, but also made food production a tool of foreign policy. American willingness to sell grain to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, or to withhold sales as punishment, demonstrated agriculture's continuing strategic importance. The institutional frameworks created during the war also proved lasting. The agricultural extension system, which had expanded dramatically during wartime, continued operating at high capacity. Land-grant universities maintained their emphasis on agricultural research and education. Government programs supporting agricultural prices and production, initially established during the Depression and expanded during the war, became permanent features of agricultural policy in the United States and many other countries. The relationship between agriculture and government changed fundamentally. Before the war, farming had been primarily a private enterprise, with limited government involvement beyond land policy and agricultural education. The war demonstrated that governments could and would intervene extensively in agricultural production and distribution. This interventionist model persisted after the war, with governments using various policies to influence what farmers grew, how they grew it, and where agricultural products were sold. Rationing systems were dismantled relatively quickly after the war ended, though some items remained rationed in Britain until the early 1950s. But the experience of rationing left lasting marks. People who had lived through wartime rationing often maintained habits of conservation and frugality for the rest of their lives. Victory gardens largely disappeared as commercial food production normalized, but interest in home vegetable gardening persisted among those who had discovered satisfaction in growing their own food. The environmental consequences of wartime agricultural intensification took decades to fully emerge. Soil erosion, caused by plowing marginal land and reducing fallow periods, created problems that became obvious only gradually. Chemical contamination of water supplies from agricultural runoff increased as fertilizer and pesticide use expanded. The loss of agricultural biodiversity as high-yield varieties replaced traditional local varieties reduced the genetic resources available for future crop improvement. These environmental costs weren't immediately apparent or widely recognized. The post-war emphasis on production and abundance overshadowed concerns about sustainability or environmental impact. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that environmental movements began questioning the agricultural model that had emerged from World War II. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, helped raise awareness of pesticide dangers. Soil conservation movements highlighted erosion problems. Alternative agriculture advocates promoted organic farming and other approaches emphasizing sustainability over maximum short-term production. The debate between productivity-focused conventional agriculture and environmentally conscious alternative approaches continues today, but the roots of that debate trace back to wartime choices about how to maximize food production. The intensive, chemical-dependent, mechanized agricultural model developed during World War II achieved its goal of dramatically increasing output. Whether that model is sustainable long-term and whether its costs outweigh its benefits remains contested. Agricultural research and development established patterns during the war that shaped subsequent decades. The close cooperation between universities, government, and private industry in agricultural research intensified during the war and continued afterward. Public funding for agricultural research increased substantially. Private companies developing seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, and equipment invested heavily in research and development. The result was continuing innovation in agricultural technology and methods. This innovation created the remarkably productive agricultural systems we see today. Modern farms produce far more food per acre and per worker than wartime farms, which themselves produced far more than pre-war farms. The yield increases for major crops have been extraordinary. Corn yields in the United States, to take one example, have increased from about 30 bushels per acre in 1940 to more than 170 bushels per acre today. Similar or greater increases have occurred for other crops and in other regions. These productivity gains have enabled global population growth. The world population in 1940 was roughly 2.3 billion people. Today it exceeds 8 billion. The agricultural systems developed during and after World War II have fed this population increase, preventing famines that would otherwise have killed hundreds of millions. This is an extraordinary achievement that shouldn't be minimized even while acknowledging the costs and problems these systems have created. The globalization of agricultural trade, accelerated by wartime mobilization and post-war aid programs, has created a world where food production and consumption are disconnected geographically. Countries that can't feed themselves from domestic production import food from countries with agricultural surpluses. This increases efficiency in some ways, allowing production to occur where conditions are most favorable. But it also creates vulnerabilities. Nations dependent on food imports face risks if trade is disrupted or if exporting nations use food as a political weapon. The cultural changes are perhaps subtler but no less profound. The connection between ordinary citizens and food production, strengthened temporarily by victory gardens and agricultural mobilization, weakened again in the post-war decades. Most people today have little direct knowledge of how food is grown or the effort required to produce it. This disconnection creates problems as consumers make demands on agricultural systems without understanding the trade-offs involved. The legacy of World War II's agricultural mobilization is complex and multifaceted. It includes genuine achievements, increased productivity, technological innovation, expanded food security for billions of people. It also includes costs, environmental degradation, loss of rural communities and agricultural knowledge, creation of agricultural systems dependent on unsustainable inputs. Understanding this legacy requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. The agricultural mobilization helped win the war and prevented post-war famines. It also created systems and patterns that present ongoing challenges. As we face contemporary agricultural challenges, climate change, soil degradation, water scarcity, the need to feed a growing population sustainably, the lessons from World War II's agricultural mobilization remain relevant. The war demonstrated that agricultural systems can transform rapidly when necessity demands it. It showed that production can increase dramatically through technology, organization, and human effort. It proved that entire populations can be mobilized around agricultural goals. These lessons offer both hope and caution as we navigate the agricultural challenges of the 21st century. We began with a farmer in 1943, working worn equipment, doing work once done by his sons who are now overseas, helped by his daughter doing labor once considered unsuitable for women. That image, repeated across millions of farms on every continent, represents the reality of World War II's agricultural mobilization. It was a transformation as total as any in history, touching every farm, every farmer, every family meal. The scale of the achievement deserves recognition. American farmers increased production by 25% while their workforce shrank dramatically. British allotment gardeners produced 1.3 million tons of vegetables. Soviet agricultural workers kept producing even as German armies advanced and retreated across their fields. Chinese farmers fed resistance forces while Japanese occupation armies seized their harvests. Across the world, under conditions that ranged from difficult to impossible, farmers and gardeners produced the food that sustained armies, fed civilians, and ultimately enabled victory. This mobilization required sacrifice, often unnoticed and unrecognized. Farmers worked longer hours with worse equipment. They sent their children to war and their crops to distant shores while often going hungry themselves. They transformed their lands, their methods, their entire way of life to meet demands that seemed impossible. When the war ended, they didn't receive victory parades or medals. They simply went back to work, planting the next year's crops, rebuilding what war had destroyed, trying to create sustainable lives from the exhaustion and trauma of total mobilization. The human stories behind the statistics deserve remembering. The land girl who learned to plow fields and discovered capabilities she didn't know she possessed. The bracero who left family in Mexico to thin sugar beets in Colorado, sending money home, dreaming of return. The German prisoner of war who picked cotton in Texas and saw America not as propaganda had portrayed it, but as a real place with real people. The Soviet woman who drove a tractor toward the front lines as German artillery boomed in the distance. The Japanese child sent to the countryside, hungry and homesick, helping plant sweet potatoes. The American teenager who spent summer vacation harvesting wheat, earning money for college, learning that work could be meaningful and exhausting simultaneously. These individual stories, multiplied millions of times across all nations and circumstances, constitute the lived reality of agricultural mobilization. They remind us that history isn't just about statistics and policies, but about people making choices, adapting to circumstances, finding reserves of strength and determination they didn't know they possessed. The food produced by this mobilization quite literally won the war. Armies cannot fight on empty stomachs. Factory workers cannot build weapons and vehicles without adequate nutrition. Civilian populations cannot sustain morale and effort without being fed. The Allies, particularly the United States, had agricultural advantages that proved as decisive as any military superiority. The Axis powers, particularly Germany and Japan, faced agricultural limitations that contributed materially to their defeats. Food shaped strategy, influenced diplomacy, and determined who could sustain the grinding attrition of total war. Yet this dimension of the war has been largely forgotten. In popular memory, we remember D-Day, but not the harvest that fed the armies that landed on the beaches. We remember Pearl Harbor, but not the victory gardens that supplemented rationed diets. We remember Stalingrad, but not the collective farms that kept producing grain while battles raged. This forgetting does disservice to history and to the people who performed these essential labors. Agricultural mobilization during World War II offers lessons that remain relevant. It demonstrates that food security is a strategic necessity, not a luxury that can be taken for granted. It shows that agricultural systems can transform rapidly when circumstances demand. It proves that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when properly motivated and organized. It reminds us that victory in any large-scale conflict requires not just military forces, but entire societies organized for production and sacrifice. The legacy of this mobilization shapes our world today. The agricultural systems we depend on, the technologies we employ, the policies that govern food production and distribution, all bear marks of decisions made and patterns established during those war years. Understanding that legacy helps us grapple with contemporary agricultural challenges. The same spirit of innovation, the same capacity for mobilization, the same willingness to transform practices when necessity demands. These remain available to us as we face new challenges. As you go about your day, eating meals you perhaps take for granted, pause occasionally to consider the agricultural systems that produce that food. Those systems didn't appear from nowhere. They were shaped by history, including the crucible of World War II. Farmers today, whether they realize it or not, work within frameworks and use technologies that trace back to that era. The food on your plate connects you to that history in tangible ways, and perhaps consider growing something yourself, even if just herbs in a window box or tomatoes in a container on a balcony. It's a small act, but it creates a connection to soil and seasons, to the effort required to transform seeds into sustenance. It honors, in a small way, the millions of people who gardened and farmed during the war years, who discovered that producing food wasn't just necessity, but also meaning, not just work, but also connection to something larger than themselves. The story of agricultural mobilization during World War II is ultimately a story about human adaptability and determination. It's about what becomes possible when people understand what's at stake and commit themselves to collective action. It's about the unglamorous, essential work that sustains civilizations. It's about farmers and gardeners, men and women and children who fed the war and in doing so helped shape the world we inhabit today. They deserve to be remembered. Their story deserves to be told. And the lessons from their experience deserve to inform how we think about agriculture, food security, and our relationship to the land that feeds us. If you found this story of agricultural mobilization compelling, if you learned something about a dimension of World War II that's often overlooked, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Whispering Wars. There are countless other forgotten stories from the war years waiting to be explored, stories that deserve telling, stories that offer insights into who we were and who we've become. Join me in bringing these stories to light. Until next time, thank you for listening, and remember that history is written not just by generals and politicians, but by farmers and workers, by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Their stories matter. Their sacrifices deserve recognition, and their legacy shapes us still.